Okay. I like to nail a lot of the important stuff on things to learn and to know that other people never hit upon or never actually strike a coherent note on. And I want to make a message to you that nothing would help your photography. Well, there are a lot of things that help your photography, anybody's photography, better than its understanding specifically as it applies to digital photography, is that I'd like you to remember one phrase, and you should really repeat it to yourself 3 times, because I've had countless, well, probably thousands of people tell me the wrong thing, and it's a misapprehension of the way digital photography works. And this phrase is, make light in your camera and make darkness in your computer. Well, what does that mean? Make light in your camera, but make darkness in your computer. One specific thing. This is mostly applicable to mirrorless photography. I don't care which mirrorless camera it is, but it's applicable to all photography. A lot of people will want to only expose for the highlights, and that's perfectly fine. So what's the issue with that? Why is ETTR photography, which means exposed to the right, the maximum potential dynamic range of your camera? A lot of people will look through their electronic viewfinder on the back of their LCD screen and say, there's some really harsh light on some sort of beautiful subject or object or person's face, whatever it may be, and they will dial down the exposure invariably 2.5 stops, 3 stops, where they've taken the speculars, i.e. the highlights, and they've made it the true tonality, i.e. the mid-tone of their subject. The shadows are just, they're gone. I mean, they can be extracted in Lightroom, but what is the serious issue with this? Remember the phrase that I just said that you should probably repeat to yourself 3 times, and it will help you so drastically. And I don't care whether you use Lightroom or Capture One, whatever sort of raw image processor that you use, it's so incredibly important to tell yourself this: make light in your camera and make darkness or shadows in your computer. If someone is underexposing purposely, they'll actually hear this phrase quite often. Well, I love mirrorless, and I'm not dissing mirrorless cameras since I have obviously more than a few of them. I love mirrorless cameras because I got WYSIWYG, which stands for what you see is what you get. I'll dial down the exposure, and I just want, you know, this drastic lighting where everything is just gone except for the highlights. The only thing, and it's exposed correctly, however you choose to expose it. So you actually have true saturation, or mostly so, but really it's like 1.5 stops or 2 1/3 stops depending on the dynamic range of your camera, but nevertheless easily adjustable in any slider in Lightroom or whatever it is you use. What you've done is you've actually robbed your raw image, your JPEG, I hope to God you're shooting raw image, you've robbed the shot of sensor saturation, which is absolutely everything. You've robbed it of detail, micro contrast tonality, true color. You've robbed it of true color tone reproduction, and you've totally just dumped on the shadows. The shadows are mud. You'll notice that obviously there's a lot of tricks you could use, which are, you know, if it wasn't ever captured in your sensor, by the way, do I have to tell anybody? People think that you can, of course, do a lot of tricks in Lightroom and Photoshop or Capture One or whatever raw processing you use, but when you've made mud out of your shadows and the details are gone, they're gone. And this is not simply for the photography where you want to expose only for the highlights and drop everything to the shadows, where, say, the composition of your shot is 10% based upon, 10% of the shot is correctly exposed, and the rest is completely in the black. If you want to do that, that's fine, but you don't do that here in your camera. You do it here on your computer. A spot meter for your highlights. This, of course, is dependent on the dynamic range of your camera. Spot meter for the highlights, and open up a stop or stop and 3/4. Depends, like I said, on the dynamic range of your camera. Depends on well, yeah, excuse me, I was thinking about 10 things at once, but the dynamic range of your camera, I mean, it could be up as much as 2 1/3 stops, and I'm sure you don't have a phase 1, so you can't go like 3 stops above on your highlights and blow the detail out. But I mean, ETTR, exposing to the right, is so incredibly important. If you, for example, let's just take a look at this fireplace scene. You want everything to be in the black but the fire. Okay, so what you're going to do, say for example, and this is what people will do, especially applicable to any DSLR, but specifically so to mirrorless. Well, my LCD or my EVF is going to tell me what my picture is going to look like. It's like, yeah, well, this is true. So I see this, I don't want all this detailing here. That's just a shot that you choose compositionally. And so I'm going to dial down the exposure by a stop and 3/4 or 2 stops. So now the flames are perfectly visible, but I only have the outline of the logs. Why is this a bad idea? You've got the shot in camera that you wanted. So where's the issue? You've lost out on true sensor saturation. You've lost out on the maximum amount of color reproduction and tonality and detail in your highlights, and you sure as hell have lost it. No matter how much recovery you do, it will still look like mud. I mean, you can do a Hail Mary pass, and depends on what the dynamic range of your camera is or how good your shadow recovery skills are in Photoshop. But I mean, time is money. I mean, why would you want to piss away unnecessary time trying to save your shadows, which are hanging by their fingertips on the edge of the cliff where they're about ready, where they basically have fallen off? Why? If you want 90% of this shot to be black, as an example, and the only thing to appear, the fire licking on top of the logs, which are all in black, if that's your compositional choice, you don't do that in your camera. You do it in Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever image processing software you do use or prefer to use. And this, of course, is an incredibly important reason why you should be shooting RAW. For sake of workflow, most professionals shoot RAW plus fine because you can actually browse through your JPEGs and sort out which of the hell are the best shots. And you use those JPEGs as indicators of the shots that you want to process in the corresponding RAW. But you make light in your camera and you make shadows in your computer. This is one of the serious issues with WYSIWYG photography in all mirrorless cameras. What you see is what you get because it engenders complacency and laziness. Period. There's no denying this. You should, if you don't have the skills, then go out and just practice for a day. And you can make a lot of mistakes in a day or a week, and you'll hone your skills. Learn to spot meter, learn to what is the dynamic range of your camera, what to spot meter for, and engage in. And if there are 1,000 videos on ETTR, which means exposed to the right, max out the potential of saturation that you could actually apply given the dynamic range of the scene of whatever it is you're shooting. Max that out to its supreme potential. When you're not, it's no different than shooting some old 8-year-old camera with crappy dynamic range. You're basically turning your professional advanced camera, whether that be a DSLR or mirrorless, into a throwback camera with limited dynamic range. It's like, well, I went out and took this shot, well, what did you do? Well, I had it on matrix metering. Well, that's fine in some cases, but I mean, did you check the scene to see that you could actually expose it a little bit more? Well, not really. I mean, you're choking off. I mean, shooting RAW, shooting JPEG only, for example, of course, is a heinous way of choking off the capabilities of your camera. The second most heinous way to choke off the capabilities of your obviously expensive camera is to limit it to the dynamic range of exposure given the shot of the composition that you're taking to the sensor. Sensor saturation is absolutely everything. This is why flash photography and stroboscopic photography makes up 95% of professional photography. If you want your shot to look black, if you want to kill off the shadows, that's fine. I've had so many people that tell me that they do this and they want to, well, I just want to see, I saw this building or I saw a person. I just, I wanted the shot to be dark. So what I did is I spot metered for the highlights. Well, that's wrong. Because when you spot meter for when you actually stick your camera in spot meter, whether it's a Nikon, Fuji, Sony, doesn't matter what it is, it wants to turn everything into, actually the color of this table, wants to turn everything into this tonality of exposure. It wants to turn everything into this level of gray. It is not interested in ETTR, or sensor saturation. You need to learn that if you're going to meter for your highlights, well, my camera has so-and-so dynamic range. My camera has just told me that spot metering for the highlight in this scene that I should expose for this. And since I know that it is exposing my highlights for gradient gray, since it's reflectance metering, not incidence, it's reflectance metering, that I should open up another, depending on the DR of your camera. You know, stop, stop and a third, 2 stops, 2 and a third stops. ETTR is incredibly important. When people try to create shadows in their camera, the only thing they're doing is they're robbing their RAW and JPEG files of sensor saturation, detail, micro contrast tonality, color, color tone reproduction, especially important in skin tones. I mean, this is, I actually don't know, I mean, people of course talked about in countless YouTube videos, and also too in photography books, you know, about ETTR photography, but they don't actually bring it to the forefront and say, well, why? I mean, they don't say something as simple as, you know, make as much light as you can in your camera. If you want to make shadows, that's fine. If you take that perfectly exposed shot and you've maxed out the sensor saturation, yeah, but when I bring the camera into my computer, you know, all the logs, I can see all the details, I can see the bricks behind. That's not what I wanted. It's like, yeah, that's what your raw file is for. Now you have true tonality, color reproduction, and the best amount of detail and micro contrast in the highlights that you do want. If you want to drop your shadows into the dirt and make it completely pitch black, you know, then drag your sliders in Lightroom and make it exactly the way you want. You do that here. You don't do it in your camera. There's not a single professional photographer on earth that can disagree with this video. It is absolutely effing impossible. Sensor saturation is everything. We're not talking about film photography, okay? Even in film photography, you know, you sit there on the enlarger, you don't have to expose the details of the shadow. I mean, you flick my enlarger on and off, and if I only want exposure for the highlights, then that's all I do. I mean, even in film photography is no different. Knowing the dynamic range of your camera and how to meter for the highlights, and then how much to raise it, given the specular, i.e. highlight headroom of your camera, is incredibly important. If you're going to just matrix meter everything and all the shots come out, you know, so-and-so, and that's what you're happy with, that's fine, but don't, you know, dial in. And it's there. People use it, and they really shouldn't be using it. Well, yeah, sure they should. Well, I mean, there are countless reasons to use it. They'll dial in their exposure compensation. It's like, yeah, I just want, you know, I don't want the scene to be so bright. I want a meter from my highlights. Well, the JPEG will come out perfectly fine enough. I hope you're not using your JPEG for printing, since you don't have any room there with the tones and the fact that a JPEG is garbage compared to a true RAW file. But now your computer doesn't have much to work with. It's like, well, why not? Well, you dropped out 2 1/3 stop, I mean a stop and 3/4 or 2 stops of detailed information. When you drop and only expose for your highlights, you're not only dropping out information in the shadows, which is obvious, for God's sake, since you're only exposing for your highlights. When you drop 2 stops on your exposure, you're dropping 2 stops on everything. The midtones, the speculars, and the shadows. There's no such thing as exposure compensation for reducing exposure compensation for highlights or shadows or midtones. You know, you limit the gain and time, i.e. aperture and shutter speed, to your sensor, you're limiting it to everything. When you choke off the light to your sensor, you're choking off the light to everything. There are future sensors, however, where this is cause for manipulation, and of course that's future technology, but I mean, all the digital cameras out there now, that's what you're left with. So I hope you liked this video. It's actually an incredibly important video, and have a nice weekend. Luxi veritas, uvidím se, do svidania, paka, aloha. And if you like these videos, you can click the link below. Tell me to jump off a cliff, which many people have done. Whatever makes you happy. Just want you to be happy. You know, life is short and crappy, and it's full of pain and suffering. Do stuff to make your life easier, not harder. Thank you, and goodbye.